His name opens the list of the seven sages. But to call him simply a philosopher is like calling the ocean simply a collection of water. He did not merely reflect on lofty matters. He invented the very possibility of science itself. Before him, the world resembled a fairy tale that adults continued to believe in. After him, the world became a system of laws, a system that could be calculated, predicted, and used. There is a piece of knowledge so fundamental that we accept it as part of the landscape, like the very air we breathe. But it did not emerge from nothing. In a world where thunder was considered the cry of a god, and an earthquake was the stomp of a restless titan, someone had to be the first to say, no. Someone had to commit the greatest and most silent crime in human history, to take the world from the gods and give it to reason. 2,000 years before the first electric lamp was lit in Europe, this child, the son of Phoenician wanderers, discovered the power sleeping in amber. While others were offering sacrifices to Zeus, Thales asked the question that changed everything. What if the sky does not rage? What if it obeys geometry? He was born around 624 BC, a moment when Miletus was the crossroads of the known world. His father, Examius, and his mother, Cleobulina, belonged to the noble house of the Thalidae, Phoenicians by blood, descendants of the legendary Cadmus, who brought the gift of the alphabet to the Greeks. Thales was born a foreigner, the one who brought the ancient, cold wisdom of the East to Greece. His father was a master, a gem engraver, or a wealthy merchant. He trained Thales to see that every object has a form, a weight, and an edge. But while the father was counting profits, the child saw something else entirely. He saw patterns in the stars, mathematical proportions in the curves of ship sails, and a hidden logic beneath the chaos of the harbor crowd. To young Thales, the city was not just a home. It was a vast ship sailing upon a bottomless ocean. In those days, there was no division between scientist and philosopher. Wisdom was a unity. If you could calculate a ship's path by the stars, you were a mathematician. If you asked why the stars shine, you became a philosopher. He stood by the water's edge for hours, watching the sea. His peers saw the domain of the god Poseidon. Thales saw the Arché, the first principle, a living, fluid substance that could be vapor under the sun and solid stone in the shadow of the mountains. If everything can turn into water and emerge from it, does it mean the world has a single, solitary root? It was Thales who turned the mythical Great Bear into a navigational tool. He led the Greeks out of the fog of legends toward the precision of calculation. But here lies the great mystery. How could a man whose life seems like a collection of geometric theorems claim that the world is full of gods? How did he fuse cold calculation with mystical contemplation? They laughed at him. A neighbor's servant girl giggled when he fell into a well while gazing at the stars. You want to know what is in the sky, yet you do not see what is beneath your feet. But Thales knew, to truly see what is beneath your feet, you must first understand how the heavens are built. His life was only beginning. To prove that reason is stronger than fear, to measure the pyramids by their shadows, and stop a war with a single prediction, the child of the sea had to leave his cradle. He was setting out in search of the truth that would transform him from an engraver's son into the man who invented Western civilization. The young man has left his native Miletus far behind, seeking answers that his home could no longer provide. It is the late 7th century BC, and Thales is sailing toward the heart of Egypt. The salt spray of the Aegean fades as the water beneath the keel turns thick and brown. He stands at the bow, watching the massive delta of the Nile open its arms, reaching the edge of the world's oldest empire. He steps onto the sun-drenched docks of Naucratis, the only port where Greeks are permitted to breathe Egyptian air. He is a stranger in a land of giants, carrying nothing but his father's seals and a hunger for what lies upstream. Around him, the air is heavy with the scent of lotus, mud, and the ancient dust of a civilization that was old before his people learned to write. As he sails south along the Nile, the scale of the world changes. He is moving toward Memphis, the magnificent capital and the beating heart of the pharaoh's power. He gazes up at stone faces taller than the masts of his ship, silent gods carved from single blocks of granite. In Miletus, men build with wood and brick. Here, they speak to eternity in stone. In the markets of Memphis, he observes the precision of the East. He watches as merchants calculate the price of grain and the weight of gold with a speed no Greek can match. He realizes that for these people, mathematics is not a hobby. It is the very language of survival, trade, and the divine order of the state. He follows the royal surveyors along the banks of the Nile, the rope stretchers. As the river floods retreat, they use knotted cords to redraw the boundaries of the fields. Thales kneels in the silt, watching how 3 knots, 4 knots, and 5 knots create a perfect square corner every single time. He enters the temple of Heliopolis, the city of the sun. He sits on the cool stone floor before a priest whose skin is like parched papyrus. They do not speak of myths or legends. They speak of the movements of the stars and the mechanical secrets of the rising water. Thales begins to translate their practical magic into the language of logic. Night after night, he climbs to the temple roofs. He compares the Babylonian charts he saw in the ports with the Egyptian records that stretch back thousands of years. He is stitching together the heavens, finding the patterns that link the east to the west, realizing that the stars are not gods, but markers of time. He studies the machines of the Nile. He watches the wooden gears of the water wheels and the slope of the canals that feed the desert. He sees how human hands can direct the flow of nature. To him, this is not just engineering. It is a demonstration of how the world truly works without the intervention of the divine. On the banks of the Nile, he begins to simplify what the priests have made complex. He strips away the rituals and leaves only the lines. In the sand of Egypt, the first formal proofs are born, as he turns the surveyor's practical rope into the philosopher's eternal law. But his greatest challenge still awaits him in the desert. One afternoon, he walks to the edge of the Giza Plateau. The great pyramid of Khufu towers above him, a mountain of stone that no man has ever dared to measure, a riddle that has stood for 2 millennia. He plants his staff in the sand and waits for the sun to move. Tomorrow, the world will see its first miracle of reason. The Great Pyramid of Khufu was too high to climb and too vast to measure. But Thales found a way to force the sun itself to reveal this secret, turning the sky into a giant drawing tool. He stands on the Giza Plateau, his feet sinking into the fine, golden silt that has buried the dreams of 1,000 travelers. Before him lies a mountain of limestone, a geometric riddle made of 2 million blocks of stone. The Egyptian priests watch from a distance, confident that the height of their pyramid is a secret protected by the heavens. Thales ignores their silence. He holds a simple wooden staff, its surface weathered by the salt of the Aegean Sea. He drives the wood deep into the sand, making sure it stands perfectly vertical to the horizon. He does not look at the pyramid. He looks at the ground. He is waiting for the precise moment of intersection, a brief window in time when the laws of the universe collapse into a single ratio. He knows the secret of similarity. He knows that if 2 triangles share the same angles, their sides must share the same proportions. The sun moves across the arc of the sky, dragging the shadows behind it like dark silk. Thales watches the shadow of his staff grow longer and longer. He waits until the length of the shadow on the sand is exactly equal to the height of the staff above the ground. At this magic instant, a perfect right-angled isosceles triangle is formed by the light. He knows that the same sun is striking the peak of the pyramid at the same angle. Therefore, the shadow of the pyramid must also be equal to its height. He marks the end of the giant shadow and calculates the distance to the center of the base. With a few steps, he has conquered the stone. He has invented the formal proof, proving that the mind can reach the summit of a mountain without moving a single grain of rock. Nobody in the ancient world dared to ask why the Nile flows, for the answer lay in the realm of the sacred. But Thales turned the greatest river of the East into a physical problem, trying to prove that even divine waters obey the laws of pressure and obstruction. He stands deep in the swaying reeds of the delta, where the air is heavy with the scent of damp earth and the sweet rot of the marshes. The water rises around his ankles, a relentless, silted tide that swallows the black soil of Egypt. To the priests, this is the annual procession of a god, a miracle that requires blood and prayer to sustain the life of the kingdom. Thales feels the cold sting of the Etesian winds blowing from the north, striking his face with the salt of the distant sea. He watches how these powerful gusts lash against the surface of the river, pushing the massive volume of water back toward the south. His mind creates a map of invisible forces. He realizes that the Nile does not swell because of a divine decree, but because the northern winds act as a giant wall, blocking the exit to the Mediterranean. He sees the struggle of the current as it fights against the air, forced to spill over its banks when it can no longer move forward. He kneels in the rising flood, feeling the immense weight of the current pressing against his skin. To Thales, the Nile is not a deity, but a machine of fluid and force. He is stripping away the masks of the gods to reveal the gears of the world. Even though his theory of the winds will later be replaced by the truth of the southern rains, his question remains the spark of a revolution. He has dared to treat the pulse of a civilization as a mechanical event. In the silence of the delta, the river is no longer a mystery to be feared, but a phenomenon to be understood through the lens of reason. While the rest of the world saw in the stars only the scattered lights of the gods, in the dusty libraries of Babylon, the priests were turning the sky into an endless ledger. Thales arrived there not for prophecies, but for the numbers that had been accumulating for thousands of years. He stands upon the summit of a colossal brick ziggurat, where the air is thin and sharp with the smell of drying bitumen and ancient dust. Below him, the lights of the city flicker like fallen embers, but above him, the heavens open in a terrifying clarity that only the desert can provide. Beside him stands a silent guardian of the night, a Chaldean watcher whose skin is stained with the gray soot of the temple lamps. The priest leads Thales into a chamber filled from floor to ceiling with shelves of unbaked clay. There is a specific sound here, a dry and rhythmic clicking as the scribe moves the tablets of the Saros cycle. Thales runs his fingers over the surface of a tablet, feeling the sharp edges of the cuneiform wedges that represent the movements of the moon and the sun. These are not poems or prayers. They are records of every shadow and every light that has crossed the sky for centuries. To the Babylonians, these marks are the habits of the divine, but to the Greek mind of Thales, they are the heartbeat of a machine. He realizes that the terror of the sky is merely a matter of repetition. If a shadow fell once, it must fall again according to the cold logic of the count. He watches the priest mark the position of a wandering planet with a reed stylus, the damp clay yielding to the pressure of human observation. Thales begins to see the invisible threads that tie the past to the future. He gathers the data of the East to forge the reason of the West. On this high tower of brick, the stars cease to be distant masters and become subjects of the law. He prepares to take these stolen secrets back to his ship, knowing that he now carries the power to predict the darkness itself. The Babylonians knew how to build, and the Egyptians knew how to measure, but none of them asked why their rules worked every single time and in every single place. Thales of Miletus became the first man to seek not just a solution, but an eternal truth hidden behind the form. He sits on the salt-stained deck of a ship sailing toward the coast of Ionia, surrounded by a heavy sea that mirrors the vastness of his thoughts. The wooden hull groans against the rhythm of the Mediterranean waves, and the air is thick with the spray of the brine and the scent of old cedar. Before him lie the clay tablets of the East and the papyrus scrolls of the South, filled with the practical recipes of 1,000 years. Thales watches the orange glow of a lamp flicker against a diagram he has scratched into a sheet of light-colored parchment. To the masters of Memphis, geometry was a tool to mark the boundaries of the mud. To the watchers of Babylon, numbers were the shadows of the stars. But Thales sees something deeper. He picks up a piece of charcoal and draws a perfect circle, then strikes a single line through its center. Thales divides the circle into 2 equal parts and sees the inevitable logic that binds the arc to the line. He realizes that a truth is only a truth if it can be proven to any mind, regardless of the temple or the king. The salt wind whistles through the rigging as he begins to strip away the mystery from the math. He replaces the magic of the priests with the cold clarity of the proof. This is the moment the apprentice becomes the architect of the Western mind. He is no longer just a collector of facts, but a creator of laws. In the silence of the night sea, the language of nature is translated into the language of human reason. He knows that when he steps off the gangplank in Miletus, he will bring with him a power greater than any army. the power of a mind that has learned to ask why. There are moments when the cargo of a single ship weighs more than the gold of an entire kingdom. The city of Miletus waited for the return of a wealthy merchant with holds full of rare fabrics, but Thales stepped ashore with a burden that could not be weighed on market scales. He brought with him a new world where the reason of man was equal to the power of the gods. He stands on the wooden deck as the ship glides into the familiar embrace of the harbor. The air is thick with the scent of salt, drying fish, and the sweet pine resin of the Ionian docks. He hears the rhythmic cries of the gulls and the distant hammer of the shipwrights, sounds that once defined his life as a man of trade. Thales feels the heavy weight of the papyrus scrolls tucked beneath his arm, their surface rough and dry against his skin. As the gangplank lowers, he sees the faces of his neighbors and friends, their eyes searching for the glitter of jewels or the glint of Egyptian bronze. But Thales carries a different kind of light. He steps onto the warm stone of the pier, feeling the solid ground of his ancestors. He looks at the ancient statues of the gods that guard the entrance to the city, figures of marble and bronze that once commanded his absolute fear. Now, he sees them through the lens of geometry and mass. He reaches out and places his palm against a sun-drenched marble column. He does not feel the presence of a spirit, but the calculated strength of the stone and the perfect verticality of its form. His friends gather around him, asking of the wonders of the Nile and the secrets of the East. Thales smiles, but his gaze is fixed on the horizon where the sea meets the sky. He realizes that the walls of Miletus have grown small, for his mind has traveled beyond the reach of myth. He has returned not to sell goods, but to plant the seeds of a revolution. In the heat of the afternoon sun, the first school of free reason begins its silent birth on the shores of Ionia. We are used to dividing the world into the hard and the soft, the living and the dead, but Thales was the first to find a universal key that opened every door of nature. Standing on the shore of the sea, he realized that water is not just an element, but the very substance of being, taking on 1,000 different forms. He walks along the edge of the surf at dawn, feeling the cold, rhythmic pulse of the tide as it washes over his bare feet. The air is thick with a heavy mist that blurs the line between the sky and the earth. To his eyes, the morning dew on the grass, the steam rising from a heated bowl, and the hard white crust of the winter frost are all masks worn by the same hidden actor. Thales kneels and dips his hand into a shallow pool left behind by the retreating waves. He watches the liquid slip through his fingers, translucent and unyielding. His mind reaches forward across the centuries toward another thinker, Heraclitus, who would later say that a man never steps into the same river twice because the water is always in flow. Thales is the one who discovered the river itself. He sees that life is a constant transformation of moisture. He realizes that if everything can change into something else, there must be a single, eternal source beneath the surface. He speaks the words into the salt wind. All is water. This is the birth of the great Arché, the first attempt to explain the universe without the interference of a god. The world suddenly becomes transparent, like a single drop of dew caught in the sun. He has replaced the chaotic whims of 1,000 spirits with the quiet, steady flow of a single material law. As he stands up and looks out at the endless horizon, he knows that he has given humanity a way to find order in the storm. The substance of the stars and the substance of the soul are now parts of the same vast, liquid unity. We are used to considering only that which breathes and moves as being alive, but Thales expanded the boundaries of life to the very edges of the cosmos. Holding a black piece of magnetic ore in his hands, he realized that the world is full of gods, not in the form of idols, but in the form of forces that make iron dance in the void. He sits in the deepening twilight of his home in Miletus, the air around him cooled by the evening breeze of the Aegean. On his table lies a fragment of dark stone from Magnesia and a golden bead of amber. He feels the cold, heavy density of the mineral and the light, fossilized warmth of the resin. To any other man, these are dead objects, but to Thales, they are silent witnesses to a hidden pulse. He takes a piece of wool and rubs the amber until a dry crackle fills the silence of the room. He watches as tiny bits of straw and dust leap toward the golden bead, clinging to it as if pulled by an invisible hand. Then, He brings the magnetic stone close to a needle of iron. The metal shudders and springs to life, reaching for the dark rock with a desperate, silent hunger. Thales feels the tension in the space between them, a shivering energy that defies the touch. He concludes that if a stone has the power to move, it must possess a kind of soul. He speaks softly into the shadows, stating that all things are full of gods. By this, he does not mean the bearded masters of Olympus, but the internal, driving spirits of the material world. He has discovered that nature is not a passive stage, but an active participant, woven together by threads of attraction and repulsion. The stone is no longer just a stone, it is a vessel of agency. In this quiet room, the distinction between the living and the inanimate begins to dissolve. Thales has found the soul of the machine, proving that the entire universe is a single, vibrant organism, bound by laws that are as invisible as they are absolute. In history, there are days when the fates of entire empires are decided not by the strength of the sword, but by the power of a single thought written on a scrap of papyrus. While thousands of warriors prepared to kill one another, Thales of Miletus knew the exact hour when the sky itself would extinguish the light to stop this madness. This happened on the 28th of May in the year 585 BC. The battle lines are drawn near the Halys River, where the Lydian and Median armies face each other in a storm of bronze and dust. Thales is not a neutral observer. He stands as a trusted advisor to the Lydian king Aleats, having whispered a dangerous secret into the ear of his monarch. The air is thick with the scent of sweat and the iron tang of unsheathed blades. The Lydian king walks before his troops, not with fear, but with the cold confidence of a man who owns the future. He taunts his enemies, claiming that the gods themselves will strike the sun from the sky to punish the Medes. The enemy laughter dies in their throats as the light begins to fail. It is not the soft fading of evening, but a cold gray that drains the color from the earth. Above the clashing of spears, a terrifying shadow begins to bite into the golden disk of the sun. The warriors freeze as a black void replaces the eye of heaven. To the Medes, this is the roar of an angry god siding with the Lydians. They fall to their knees in the gathering dark, overcome by an ancient terror. Thales has used the Babylonian cycles to give the Lydian crown a miracle of timing. The darkness lasts only minutes, but when the light returns, the war is over. The Medes are so shaken by the accurate threat of the king that they immediately beg for peace. A treaty is signed, and a double marriage is arranged to seal the bond. In this moment, the human race learns that the stars do not rule us through fear, but can be mastered by the elegant laws of time and motion used as a weapon of the mind. The darkness of the eclipse did not just end a battle. It gave birth to a dynasty through a diplomatic masterstroke that turned enemies into kin. To ensure that the peace treaty was more than just a scrap of parchment, the kings of Lydia and Media decided to cement their bond with the weight of blood. The scheme was as precise as the geometry of Thales. Arienes, the daughter of the Lydian king Aleats, was given in marriage to Astyages, the son of the Median king Cyaxares. In an age where signatures carried little weight, only the mingling of royal lines could guarantee that the swords would remain in their sheaths. In the magnificent city of Sardis, the air was heavy with the scent of roasted meat, expensive perfumes, and the smoke of celebratory fires. On a high stone dais, the young princess Arienes stood beside her new husband, their robes of purple and gold reflecting the afternoon sun. It was the year 585 BC, and the city celebrated a union born from the shadow of the moon. The kings of Babylon and Cilicia acted as the grim mediators of this ceremony, watching as the vows were exchanged under the watchful eyes of their gods. They forced the warring sides to trade brides instead of blows, believing that future heirs with the blood of both kingdoms would never dare to strike their own kin. From this very union, Mandane was born, the woman destined to become the mother of Cyrus the Great. Cyrus would grow to become the legendary founder of the Persian Empire, the king of kings who conquered Babylon and liberated the nations. Through the calculation of Thales, the seeds of the greatest empire the world had ever seen were silently sown in the dust of a cooling battlefield. In Miletus, they said that Thales was rich in thoughts but poor in pocket, and that his wisdom was not worth a single copper coin in the marketplace. To To silence the scoffers, he decided to use the stars not for the pursuit of truth, but for the seizure of the most profitable industry in Ionian trade. While the winter winds still howled across the Aegean, Thales observed the subtle patterns of the sky and the dampness of the earth. He predicted a harvest of olives so vast that the existing presses would never be able to contain the flood of fruit. With the little money he possessed, he quietly paid deposits to rent every oil press in Miletus and on the island of Chios. Since no one else foresaw the coming bounty, he secured them for a pittance. In the late autumn, the silver-green hills groaned under the weight of dark and ripened olives. The city was filled with a frantic energy as farmers realized that the harvest was indeed miraculous. The scent of crushed fruit and bitter pulp hung heavy in the air, but the laughter of the merchants turned to desperation. There was nowhere to process the oil except through the presses held by the philosopher. Thales sat calmly at the stone entrance of a large workshop and watched the long lines of wagons stretching back into the groves. He was no longer the target of jokes, but the master of the market. He reached down and dipped his hand into a vat of warm and freshly pressed oil, watching the thick liquid flow from his fingers like liquid gold. Those who once mocked his poverty stood before him, ready to pay whatever price he demanded. Thales did not seek to ruin them, but he wanted to teach them a final lesson. He proved that philosophers were poor not because they lacked the skill to gain wealth, but because their hearts were set on a different price. He amassed a fortune in a single season only to demonstrate that for a man of reason, gold was merely a tool, while the freedom of the mind remained the only true sovereign. In ancient times, people believed that rivers were willful deities that demanded sacrifice and worship, but Thales was the first to see in them only a mass of water obeying the laws of weight and incline. By one bold maneuver, he forced the great Hallys to part before the army, forever changing the idea of what human genius could achieve on the battlefield. It was the year 547 BC, and the massive Lydian host under King Croesus stood paralyzed on the western bank. The spring floods had turned the river into a roaring monster of mud and foam that no bridge could span and no soldier could ford. The march against the Persians seemed to have reached a dead end before the first spear was even thrown. Thales walked along the high, crumbling bank and studied the curve of the land with the cold eye of a mathematician. He did not pray to the river gods or look for omens in the clouds, but instead he ordered the soldiers to take up their shovels and mattocks. Under his precise direction, the army began to dig a deep, crescent-shaped canal that started far above the camp and curved behind the lines of tents. He used the natural slope of the valley to lure the water away from its ancient bed. Thousands of men labored in the heat, moving mountains of earth to create a new path for the torrent that had dared to block their way. When the last barrier of soil was breached, the Halley shivered and began to pour its strength into the new channel. The original riverbed grew shallow and quiet, turning into a manageable stream that reached only to the knees of the infantry. The soldiers watched in silence as the invincible deity was tamed by a few lines drawn in the sand. The army of Croesus crossed the dry stones without losing a single wagon or horse. By treating the water as a servant of physics rather than a master of myth, Thales proved that the greatest obstacle in war was not the enemy or the elements, but the limits of a mind that refused to calculate. Thales understood that one could not truly possess the world without knowing its shape, and so he began to draw what others only dared to imagine. He transferred his vast travels onto a flat sheet, representing the earth as a massive disk that forever rocked upon the waves of a boundless and primordial ocean. In the quiet of his workshop in Miletus, the only sounds were the scratching of his charcoal and the distant pulse of the sea. He gathered the fragmented stories of Phoenician sailors, the precise records of Egyptian land surveyors, and his own memories of the distant horizons of Babylon. He realized that the chaos of the shores and the vastness of the deserts followed a secret order that the human mind could finally capture. He worked on a large tablet of whitened wood, carefully tracing the outlines of the 3 continents as he knew them. To Thales, the world was not a collection of divine mysteries, but a solid house floating upon the substance of all things, which was water. He placed the Mediterranean at the center of his vision, surrounding it with the jagged edges of Europe, Asia, and Libya. He drew the great rivers as veins that fed the earth, and the mountain ranges as its sturdy bones. In the year 548 BC, his map was a revelation to the people of Ionia. For the first time, a merchant or a soldier could look at a single surface and see the entirety of the oikoumene, the inhabited world of man. Through this act of creation, Thales stripped away the terrifying infinity of the unknown. He replaced the myths of distant monsters with the clarity of measured distances and shared borders. His map was more than a tool for navigation. It was a declaration of intellectual ownership over the planet. He proved that even the widest seas and the tallest peaks could be contained within the reach of human reason. As the sun set over the harbor of Miletus, the lines on his tablet glowed like a new form of law. The world had ceased to be a playground for the whims of the gods, and had become a measurable space where every nation had its place within the great liquid unity of the cosmos. Time was for the ancients a terrifying ocean without shores, but Thales decided to turn it into a road with clear milestones. By marking the points where the sun paused in its flight, he gave humanity the solar year, dividing the chaos of eternity into 365 equal parts. Before his observations, the calendar was a tangled mess of lunar cycles and the whims of priests who added days or months whenever they saw fit. This uncertainty made the planting of crops and the sailing of ships a matter of dangerous guesswork. Thales realized that the universe did not run on the moods of the gods, but on a mechanical rhythm that could be tracked with a simple wooden stake driven into the earth. He spent years watching the shadow of a tall gnomon on the flat ground of Miletus. He recorded how the noon shadow grew long in the winter and shrank to a tiny point in the heat of the summer. He noted the exact days of the solstices, when the sun seemed to stand still before reversing its path across the horizon. By measuring the intervals between these celestial anchors, he calculated the true length of the solar journey. In the year 546 BC, he presented his discovery to the people of Ionia. He proved that the year was not an approximation but a precise cycle of 365 days, a discovery he had refined through his studies of the ancient records he brought back from Egypt. This discovery brought a new kind of order to the world of man. Farmers no longer looked to the flight of birds alone to know when to plow their fields, for they now had a mathematical compass to guide their seasons. Thales had effectively captured the sun and made it a servant of human society. He showed that the infinite was not a void to be feared, but a structure to be understood. By defining the solar year, he allowed the people to plan their lives years into the future, creating a sense of stability that the world had never known. The great clock of the heavens had been deciphered, and for the first time, humanity could walk in step with the pulse of the cosmos. When Thales first announced in the square that the year would now be divided into 4 strict seasons and 365 days, many considered it a sacrilege against the ancient order. The traditionalists and the priests of the old temples were outraged, for they believed that only the gods had the right to measure the breadth of the world. They had grown wealthy and powerful by interpreting the chaotic lunar cycles, and they feared a world where any man with a wooden stake could calculate the future. But the sage knew that only predictable time would give people the freedom to build cities and empires without constantly looking back at the wrath of the gods in the heavens. In the bustling agora of Miletus, the air was thick with the scent of sea salt and the voices of arguing men. Thales stood before the crowd and explained that the sun did not move by whim, but by a law that returned to its starting point every 365 days. He demonstrated how the 4 seasons were not separate gifts from the earth, but phases of a single, magnificent circle. He argued that a merchant could now know exactly when the summer winds would fill his sails, and a builder could plan his works before the winter rains began. Slowly, the mockery of the crowds turned into a quiet realization that the world had become a more stable place. This victory of logic over superstition changed the very fabric of Greek life. The city of Miletus was the first to adopt this solar rhythm, and soon the neighboring colonies followed the example of the man who had tamed time. Thales proved that numbers possessed more power than the most ancient legends, for numbers did not lie and did not demand blood. By the year 545 BC, the solar calendar had become the foundation of Ionian civilization. Humanity ceased to be a victim of the seasons and became their observer, moving with a new confidence through a universe that had finally been stripped of its terrifying masks. Having deciphered the rhythm of the solar clock, Thales continued to search the heavens for tools to guide human life. While other nations looked to the Great Bear, he discerned a more faithful and stationary constellation, teaching Greek captains to read the star map as clearly as their new solar calendar. Before this moment, Greek sailors were forced to hug the coastline as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, fearing the trackless dark sea. They relied on the broad arc of the Great Bear, but its rotation was too wide to offer a true northern course. Thales realized that the Phoenicians, the most daring mariners of the ancient world, held a secret the Greeks had yet to learn. On the salt-stained docks of Miletus, Thales spent nights talking with foreign merchants and watching the slow tilt of the firmament. He identified the constellation of Ursa Minor, with its steadfast star that seemed to hold the very pivot of the universe. He showed shipmasters that by focusing on this smaller, tighter cluster of lights, they could maintain a needle-sharp course through the deep Mediterranean. This was the application of a mind seeking the most efficient path through the infinite. In the year 544 BC, Milesian ships began to navigate by the Small Bear, allowing them to travel during the cool of the night and cross open waters without the safety of the shore. This discovery transformed the sea from a barrier into a bridge. The night was no longer a wall of shadows, but a transparent map leading to distant colonies. By teaching men to trust the northern stars, Thales expanded the boundaries of the Greek world. Captains felt a new power, knowing celestial geometry was more reliable than shifting currents or gusts of wind. The heavens became a reliable compass. Through the vision of a single philosopher, the sailors of Ionia became masters of the night, sailing with the quiet certainty that the universe was there to guide them home. The quiet certainty of the sailors who navigated by the stars drew its strength from the conviction of the sage that man and the cosmos were created from the same living matter. Thales taught people to see in the motion of the planets and the growth of herbs the manifestation of a great and animated force that transformed scattered elements into a single, vibrating, and eternally living organism. He believed that the universe was not a collection of dead objects, but a vast body filled with the internal driving spirits of nature itself. This was the birth of Hylozoism, the understanding that life and matter were inseparable, and that even a grain of sand or a drop of water possessed a hidden pulse of agency. In his late years, Thales shared these thoughts with young minds who traveled from across the Greek world. Among them was the brilliant Pythagoras, who listened with a hunger for the underlying order of the world. While Thales spoke of the living breath of water, he inadvertently laid the foundation for the ideas that Pythagoras would later develop into the music of the spheres. Thales showed that the universe was a coherent whole, moving in a grand and silent dance where every part responded to the vibration of others. This vision suggested a divine geometry in all things, a resonance linking the individual soul to the breathing spirit of the infinite stars. As the old philosopher looked over the Aegean, he felt the energy binding the magnetic stone to iron and the sun to the seasons. He realized that if the world was alive, it was also intelligible. By studying the laws of life, man could find his place within the cosmic order. In the year 543 BC, this teaching offered a bridge between the physical and the spiritual. Thales left behind a world that was no longer a cold machine, but a vibrant and sacred home where everything shared in the same eternal and luminous existence. The divine geometry that Thales found in the stars suggested that human society should also be built on principles of balance and symmetry. He left his contemplation of the shore to prove that a philosopher's wisdom could protect state borders as reliably as his calculations guided ships. Thales was not a hermit. He was a citizen who understood that the chaos of politics required the same clarity as the study of the elements. In the year 542 BC, he became a vital voice in the councils of Ionia, advising King Croesus and Greek leaders on how to survive in a world of clashing empires. He looked at the map of the Greek world and saw a dangerous fragmentation. While Ionian cities fought over small patches of land, the shadow of the Persian East grew darker. Thales proposed a revolutionary idea: He urged the cities to form a unified federation with a single center of government in Teos. He argued that just as planets move in harmony around a central point, the Greek states had to find a common axis to remain stable. He saw politics as a problem of structural integrity where the strength of the whole was greater than the sum of its parts. His advice to King Croesus was marked by the same cautious logic. When the king sought to cross the river Halys to wage war, Thales provided the engineering to make it possible, yet he also warned of the fragility of power that ignored the balance of nature. He taught rulers that a state functions best when its laws mirror the unchanging laws of the cosmos. Although the pride of the cities often blinded them to his vision of unity, Thales remained the first thinker to apply the scientific method to governance. He proved that the mind that could predict an eclipse could also foresee the fall of a kingdom, and that true security lay in the triumph of reason over the impulsive whims of the powerful. To ensure that human laws could mirror the laws of the cosmos, Thales proposed that the cities of Ionia find their common center of gravity. At the Great Council of the Panionium, he drew a plan for a union to save their freedom, proving that independence was born in rational unity. It was the year 541 BC, and representatives of the 12 Ionian cities gathered at the sanctuary near Mount Mycale. The air was thick with the smoke of sacrifices and the tension of a world on the brink of war. Thales stood before kings and merchants, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had measured the earth and sky. He urged them to establish a single council chamber in the city of Teos, at the heart of their shared lands. He explained that while each city could keep its own customs, they had to act as one body when facing the growing darkness of the Persian East. He argued that just as planets maintained their paths because they were bound to a central order, the Greeks would only remain standing if they created a political axis. He showed them that bickering over borders was a madness that ignored the larger patterns of history. Thales was an architect of peace who saw that the survival of a culture depended on its ability to evolve beyond the walls of a single city. Despite his logic, the pride of the Ionians proved a stubborn obstacle. Many leaders feared losing personal power more than they feared the invader, struggling to grasp a vision that placed the collective good above vanity. Thales watched as his blueprint for a federal state was met with admiration and hesitant silence. He knew reason could only suggest the path, not force men to walk it. Even as the assembly dispersed, the seeds of a new political consciousness had been sown. Thales had defined the first model of a democratic confederation, proving that the search for harmony in the stars was a search for harmony among men. To ensure that human laws could mirror the laws of the cosmos, Thales proposed that the cities of Ionia find their common center of gravity. At the Great Council of the Panionium, he drew a plan for a union to save their freedom, proving that independence was born in rational unity. In the year 541 BC, representatives of the 12 Ionian cities gathered at the sanctuary near Mount Mycale. The air was thick with the smoke of sacrifices and the tension of a world on the brink of war. Thales stood before kings and merchants, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had measured the earth and sky. He urged them to establish a single council chamber in the city of Teos, at the heart of their shared lands. He explained that while each city could keep its own customs, they had to act as one body against the growing darkness of the Persian East. He argued that just as planets maintained their paths because they were bound to a central order, the Greeks would only remain standing if they created a political axis. He showed them that bickering over borders was a madness that ignored the larger patterns of history. Thales was an architect of peace who saw that the survival of a culture depended on its ability to evolve beyond the walls of a single city. Despite his logic, the pride of the Ionians proved a stubborn obstacle. Many leaders feared losing personal power more than the invader, struggling to grasp a vision that placed the collective good above vanity. Thales watched as his blueprint for a federal state was met with admiration and hesitant silence. He knew reason could only suggest the path, not force men to walk it. Even as the assembly dispersed, the seeds of a new political consciousness had been sown. Thales had defined the first model of a democratic confederation, proving that the search for harmony in the stars was a search for harmony among men. Wisdom could not belong to a single man alone, and Thales knew his greatest creation was the mind of his successor. Beneath the arches of the Milesian school, he passed the torch to Anaximander, preparing him for debate rather than obedience. Thales was now an old man, his hair white as Aegean foam, yet his eyes burned with the curiosity that had once measured pyramids. He watched Anaximander pace the stone tiles, questioning the very foundations of his master's work. In these long afternoons, the modern world was born. Thales did not demand his students memorize words as sacred oracles. He encouraged them to find flaws in his theories. When Thales spoke of water as the primary substance, Anaximander countered with the Epeiron, an infinite source preceding all elements. Thales listened with a proud smile, realizing he had succeeded. He had taught the younger man how to think, not what to think. By allowing his authority to be challenged, he ensured that reason would continue long after his own voice fell silent. Their relationship became the first model of the scientific method. They spent days comparing stars and Earth, building a bridge of logic across generations. Thales knew his life was a river flowing toward the sea, but through Anaximander, his thoughts expanded into a shoreless ocean. As the sun set over Miletus, the two men stood as twin pillars of a new era. Thales had not only deciphered nature's laws, he had cultivated a mind capable of rewriting them, proving that a teacher's immortality lies in the courage of a student to go beyond the teacher's own horizon. The flow of the old sage's thoughts finally met the ocean of ideas of the new generation, and in this merger, the truth about the boundless was born. Thales realized that his water was only a shadow of something more ancient, expanding the boundaries of his cosmos to infinity. For decades, he had argued that water was the soul of the world, but Anaximander saw a logical flaw in this simplicity. He argued that if one element were the origin of all others, its power would have long ago consumed its opposites. Thus, the true source had to be something entirely different. As they sat by the Aegean in the deepening twilight, Anaximander spoke of the Epeiron, a vast, undefined primordial substance with no beginning and no end. He described it as a boundless reservoir from which all worlds were born and into which they would return. Thales listened to the waves, but his mind was no longer focused on the liquid. He felt the magnificent weight of his student's logic, realizing that defining the source as water limited the power of nature. He saw that Anaximander had taken the final step, moving from the visible world of the senses to the invisible world of pure abstraction. Thales did not defend his theory with the bitterness of an old man. Instead, he embraced the Epeiron as the ultimate completion of his life's work. By letting go of water, he was grasping the infinite. He looked at Anaximander and saw not a rebel, but a pioneer brave enough to stand in the dark without a familiar shore. The master blessed the search for the boundless, acknowledging that the true beginning was hidden beyond visible forms. In that moment of transition, the philosophy of Miletus grew beyond the earth and sea, becoming a lighthouse pointing toward the edges of existence, where human reason finally dared to touch the eternal. The thoughts of the old sage finally met the ideas of the new generation, and in this merger, the truth about the boundless was born. Thales realized his water was only a shadow of something more ancient, expanding his cosmos to infinity. For decades, he argued water was the soul of the world, but Anaximander saw a flaw in this simplicity. He argued that if one element were the origin, it would have consumed its opposites. Thus, the true source had to be entirely different. By the Aegean in the deepening twilight, Anaximander spoke of the Epeiron, a vast, undefined substance with no beginning and no end. He described it as a boundless reservoir from which all worlds were born and into which they would return. Thales listened to the waves, but his mind moved beyond the liquid. He felt the weight of his student's logic, realizing that defining the source as water limited the power of nature. Anaximander had taken the final step, moving from the visible senses to pure abstraction. Thales did not defend his theory with bitterness. Instead, he embraced the Epeiron as the completion of his life's work. By letting go of water, he grasped the infinite. He saw in Anaximander a pioneer brave enough to stand in the dark without a familiar shore. The master blessed the search for the boundless, acknowledging that the true beginning was hidden beyond visible forms. In that moment, the philosophy of Miletus grew beyond the earth and sea, becoming a lighthouse pointing toward the edges of existence, where human reason finally dared to touch the eternal. The self-correcting path of knowledge required a deep humility, a trait that made Thales the first among equals in the council of the Seven Sages. When an oracle commanded that the most worthy be rewarded, a golden tripod pulled from the sea became a symbol of intellectual nobility. The oracle of Apollo declared it must go to the wisest, and it was sent first to Thales. In an act of profound grace, he claimed he was not the wisest and sent it to Bias of Priene. The tripod continued its journey, passing through the hands of Solon and other masters, as each demonstrated worthiness by denying his own superiority. Eventually, the prize returned to Miletus, for the great minds recognized that their shared light began with Thales. He did not accept the honor for vanity but dedicated the tripod to Apollo, acknowledging that human understanding was a reflection of a higher order. This exchange proved that the search for truth created a bond transcending borders. They were not rivals, but architects of a new world where reason was inseparable from virtue. Through friendships with Solon and the other sages, Thales helped weave scattered threads of thought into a unified fabric for human life. They shared insights on how to govern both a state and one's own soul. Thales showed that the logic predicting stars could also provide a foundation for justice. By the winter of his life, he was revered as the embodiment of human excellence. He proved that the wisest man was not one who claimed to know everything, but one who used his mind to illuminate the path for others, forever changing how the world defined the value of a life. The transformation of the value of human life began for Thales with a question addressed to his own spirit. He realized that cosmic harmony was meaningless if a man could not find harmony in his actions. Thales was the first to insist that a thinker had a moral obligation to truth. Logic was a hollow vessel without integrity. When asked what was most difficult, he did not speak of pyramids or stars. He replied, "To know oneself." He practiced an ethics of moderation, believing the golden mean found in geometry should also govern the human heart. He taught that a just life lay in never doing to others what one would blame them for doing. To Thales, the mind that perceived the orderly tides was the same mind that had to control the surges of anger and greed. He saw the soul as a territory of reason where a man had to be his own legislator. In Miletus, he recorded powerful maxims that became the foundation for Greek moral philosophy, reminding students that an ordered life was the most beautiful structure a human could build. His wisdom was expressed in sharp sentences. He warned that it was easy to give advice, but hard to follow it oneself, urging followers to be as precise in conduct as in calculations. Thales proved that the birth of science was inseparable from individual responsibility. He showed that the first philosopher did not live in the clouds, but brought the light of stars to earth to illuminate the character of his citizens. By defining excellence as the mastery of one's own nature, he provided the ethical compass that would guide seekers of truth for thousands of years. The transformation of the value of human life began for Thales with a question addressed to his own spirit. He realized that cosmic harmony was meaningless if a man could not find harmony in his actions. Thales was the first to insist that a thinker had a moral obligation to truth. Logic was a hollow vessel without integrity. When asked what was most difficult, he did not speak of pyramids or stars. He replied, "To know oneself." He practiced an ethics of moderation, believing the golden mean found in geometry should also govern the human heart. He taught that a just life lay in never doing to others what one would blame them for doing. To Thales, the mind that perceived the orderly tides was the same mind that had to control the surges of anger and greed. He saw the soul as a territory of reason where a man had to be his own legislator. In Miletus, he recorded powerful maxims that became the foundation for Greek moral philosophy, reminding students that an ordered life was the most beautiful structure a human could build. His wisdom was expressed in sharp sentences. He warned that it was easy to give advice, but hard to follow it oneself, urging followers to be as precise in conduct as in calculations. Thales proved that the birth of science was inseparable from individual responsibility. He showed that the first philosopher did not live in the clouds, but brought the light of stars to earth to illuminate the character of his citizens. By defining excellence as the mastery of one's own nature, He provided the ethical compass that would guide seekers of truth for thousands of years. This light found its brightest reflection in a young man from Samos. Thales saw in Pythagoras not just a curious youth, but a successor capable of transforming geometry into the music of the spheres. He pointed him toward the mysteries of the Nile that had once changed his own life. The meeting took place in the quiet garden of Thales and Miletus, where the old master sat in the evening coolness. He recognized in Pythagoras the same hunger for the infinite that had driven him to Egypt decades before, and he knew the torch of reason had to be carried further. Thales spoke of the importance of silence and mental discipline, urging him to travel to Memphis and Diospolis to learn from priests guarding the secrets of stars and earth. He shared foundational truths, but since the younger man would seek divine patterns within the essence of numbers, Thales did not bind the student to his own theory of water. Instead, he blessed the unique path Pythagoras was destined to walk. He understood that while he had found the physical source, Pythagoras would find the mathematical soul. Both were necessary for the human story. The encounter became a sacred bridge, ensuring the critical method of Miletus would merge with the mystical harmony of Samos. Thales shared his last scrolls and memories of the pyramids, acting as a spiritual father to the man who would found his own school. As Pythagoras departed, carrying the blessing of the first philosopher, Thales felt peace. He had not only opened the gates of reason, but ensured a worthy guardian was ready to keep them open. The connection proved that wisdom was a living current, a golden chain of minds linking the first question to final harmony. The desire to link the first question to final harmony took shape in stone when Miletus decided to immortalize its first sage. The statue of Thales in the central square became a silent mentor, reminding every passerby that true greatness is measured by the clarity of thought. It stood as physical proof of his status as one of the seven sages, positioned where the political and commercial life of the Ionian capital was loudest. Citizens placed it there not as a religious idol, but as a tribute to a human mind that replaced the ancient fear of the unknown with the precision of logic. This monument served as a permanent anchor for the city's identity, yet the stone proved more fragile than the theories of its subject. Throughout the centuries, the statue witnessed the turbulent fate of Miletus, from the Persian invasion to the eventual silence of the harbor. Due to constant wars and devastating earthquakes, the original masterpiece was lost to time, likely shattered or recycled into the walls of later fortresses. Today, no direct likeness from his own century remains. Only much later Roman copies and descriptions allow us to imagine his face. The river Meander eventually choked the city with silt, burying the streets where the statue once looked out over the Aegean. The loss of the marble highlighted a central truth. The body was temporary, but the law of the universe was eternal. Travelers visiting the ruins of the theater today find only empty pedestals, yet the presence of the philosopher is felt strongly. Thales taught that everything was in a state of flow, and the disappearance of his own monument was the final confirmation of his philosophy. He proved that the greatest gift a citizen could give to his polis was the courage to think, leaving an indelible mark on the soul of the world that no collapse of stone could ever erase. The final confirmation of the philosophy of Thales regarding the eternal flow occurred not in arguments, but on a hot afternoon when the sage closed his eyes for the last time. Sitting on a stone bench and watching the triumph of life, he felt his breath merge with the wind of Miletus. It was the period of the 58th Olympiad, and the city had gathered to celebrate the strength of its youth. Thales, burdened by more than 90 years, sat among the spectators, his frail body exhausted by the intense heat of the Ionian summer. While athletes competed for laurel wreaths, the mind of the first philosopher reached its own quiet finish line. Historical accounts tell us he did not suffer a violent end, but simply succumbed to heat, thirst, and the natural fading of his strength. He watched the runners, seeing in their effort the same vital energy he once found in water. The cheers became a distant murmur, like the sound of the sea he studied since childhood. Thales died as he lived, in the heart of his polis, surrounded by citizens he had taught to think, and the sky he had mapped with precision. When the games ended and the sun sank into the Aegean, the people realized the most luminous mind of Miletus had found peace. His death was seen not as a tragedy, but as the graceful exit of a man who completed his task and understood the timing of the cosmos. He proved that a philosopher belonged to the world, and it was fitting his last breath was drawn in the open air. By leaving his body where the city celebrated excellence, Thales provided a final lesson. Individual life is a temporary wave upon an eternal ocean, returning to the source once its journey is done. The return to the source was not an end, but the attainment of immortality within human thought. Thales showed that matter is indestructible, and his legacy became the living water that washes the minds of all who seek truth. He left no dogmas, but a method of inquiry that made every human a potential discoverer. By identifying water as the Arché, he lit the first spark of science that still guides us through the unknown. The immortality of the source lies in its capacity for renewal. Just as water cycles from marshes to clouds, his ideas flowed through Anaximander, Pythagoras, and Newton, reaching modern laboratories. Thales proved the universe is a single organism governed by logic, giving humanity the keys to its own house. His water was a metaphor for the unity of all things, a truth as solid today as it was 26 centuries ago. Today, his name is etched into the very cosmos he mapped. A prominent impact crater on the moon, located in the frozen north, bears the name Thales. In mathematics, every student encounters Thales's theorem, the eternal proof of circles and right angles. As waves wash the ruins of Miletus, his voice remains audible in our precision. By stripping away the masks of gods to look at nature, he ensured the human spirit would never be lost. The source is immortal because it is the beginning of reason, a fountain that will never run dry as long as a mind is left to wonder.